There are moments when a public story does not explode all at once, but instead begins to hum quietly in the background. Nothing obvious at first. No press conference. No urgent denial. Just a subtle shift in tone that suggests something is no longer sitting where it used to. Over the past few weeks, that quiet hum has been growing louder around a figure long accustomed to scrutiny, debate, and carefully managed attention. For years, the public has watched her navigate conflict in familiar ways. Disagreements with newspapers, tension with relatives, disputes that played out through statements, interviews, and selective silence. It became a pattern many people felt they understood. Each new issue seemed to fit inside an existing frame, another chapter in a story that, while dramatic, followed expected rules. But this situation feels different. This time, the conversation is not centered on opinion or interpretation. It does not revolve around personal feelings or media narratives. Instead, it appears to be rooted in something colder and more procedural. Contracts, transactions, records, the kind of details that do not bend easily to public sympathy or reputation management. According to emerging discussion in industry circles, a major European luxury house has taken a step that few expected. Not a warning, not a quiet negotiation behind closed doors, but a formal legal move that suggests a serious breakdown in trust. No official statement has been released to the public. There has been no confirmation from either side, yet the reaction among fashion insiders has been immediate and unusually restrained, as if many are waiting to see what surfaces next. What makes this moment stand out is not just who may be involved, but how different the balance of power appears. Luxury brands of this scale rarely act without confidence. They are built on control, patience, and long memory. When they decide to move, it is often after watching quietly for a long time. At first, the details circulating seemed almost trivial: routine purchases, returns, the kind of everyday actions that rarely attract attention. But as fragments of discussion continued to surface, some observers began to notice patterns that raised uncomfortable questions. Not accusations, not conclusions, just patterns. This is where the situation began to change. To understand why this discussion has gained traction, it helps to step back and look at the environment in which it unfolded. For more than a decade, the relationship between celebrities and luxury brands has operated on an unspoken system of trust. Public figures wear high-end clothing, the brand receives visibility, and both sides benefit without always spelling out the terms in public. Much of this system runs on reputation rather than paperwork. In this fictional world, the individual at the center of the current discussion had become known as someone who moved easily between industries. Entertainment, media, philanthropy, and fashion all overlapped in her public life. Designers competed quietly for placement. Stylists managed schedules that allowed outfits to be seen, photographed, and discussed. For the most part, these arrangements followed informal rules that everyone involved understood. Luxury houses, especially those with long histories, are careful about who they associate with. They track inventory closely. They maintain internal systems that record every movement of a garment. Items that leave flagship stores are logged, tagged, and inspected when they return. This is not about suspicion. It is about protecting products that can cost more than most cars. For a long time, there was no public sign that anything had gone wrong. Appearances continued. Photographs appeared in magazines and online. Commentators discussed style choices, not supply chains. To the outside world, everything looked normal. Behind the scenes, however, some industry watchers say the mood was shifting. According to unconfirmed commentary, certain boutiques had begun flagging repeat transactions connected to the same accounts. The actions themselves were not unusual. High-value customers often exchange items. Sizes change, preferences shift. That alone would not raise alarms. What reportedly caught attention was frequency. Over a period said to span more than a year, multiple high-cost items were allegedly purchased, briefly held, and then returned under similar circumstances. Again, this has not been officially confirmed. No documents have been released publicly, but according to those familiar with luxury retail practices, patterns matter more than individual incidents. Luxury brands do not rush to confrontation. They observe, they document, they compare notes across locations. When something does not align with expected customer behavior, they allow time to see whether it corrects itself. Only when it does not do they begin internal reviews. At the same time, the public figure's broader situation was evolving. Dia projects were changing direction. Business ventures were being restructured. Expenses were reportedly under closer review, though no financial difficulty has been formally acknowledged. None of this proves anything, but context often shapes how actions are interpreted. Within fashion circles, there is also a clear line between borrowing and buying. Official loans involve contracts, insurance, and clear return conditions. Purchases, on the other hand, transfer ownership. Returning a purchased item is allowed, but wearing it publicly often voids that option. This is a rule that exists to protect the brand's image and resale value. According to general industry standards, once an item is visibly worn at a public event, its commercial value changes. Even if the garment shows no damage, it can no longer be sold as new. That loss is absorbed by the brand unless safeguards are in place. This is why, as the background becomes clearer, some observers suggest the issue may not be about fashion at all. It may be about systems colliding. A public figure accustomed to flexibility operating within an industry that relies on rigid controls, an arrangement that worked smoothly until, at some point, it did not. By the time quiet concern turned into active discussion, the situation had already moved beyond simple misunderstanding. This is where early questions began to surface, not from tabloids or online commentators, but from within the professional spaces that rarely speak publicly at all. At this point, many people started asking questions, not because anything had been proven, but because the usual explanations no longer seemed to fit as neatly as before. In industries built on discretion, silence often means patience, not ignorance. When that silence stretches on, it can signal that something is being reviewed rather than ignored. According to public commentary from individuals familiar with luxury retail operations, the first internal discussions were not framed as accusations. They were framed as clarifications. Staff reportedly wanted to understand why similar explanations accompanied each return. Items were described as unworn, fit issues were cited, occasional defects were mentioned. Each reason, taken alone, sounded reasonable. The difficulty came when those reasons began to repeat across many transactions. In high-end retail, returns are not simply placed back on shelves. They are evaluated. Fabrics are examined under proper lighting. Stitching is checked. Linings are reviewed. This process exists to protect both the brand and future buyers. While most returns pass through without issue, some require closer attention. Observers suggest that it was during these routine inspections that concerns quietly grew, not because of dramatic damage or obvious wear, but because of subtle inconsistencies. Creases that did not match how an item would fold in packaging, fabric tension that suggested brief use. These are not things that confirm wrongdoing. They are things that raise questions. This is where the situation became more complicated. In the modern celebrity ecosystem, public appearances are not casual moments. They are planned, documented, and often photographed from multiple angles. Outfits worn at events are archived online within minutes. Even brief appearances leave a visual record. Some online discussions began to note that certain garments appearing in photographs resembled items later seen as returned. Again, this has not been verified. Images can mislead. Similar designs exist, but the overlap added another layer of uncertainty. At the same time, the role of assistants and stylists entered the conversation. In many cases, public figures do not personally handle purchases or returns. Teams manage logistics. If a misunderstanding occurred, responsibility could rest anywhere along that chain. This possibility initially softened the tone of internal discussions. However, as the pattern persisted, some insiders reportedly questioned whether coincidence alone could explain it. In professional settings, repetition suggests process, and process suggests intent, even if that intent is not malicious. Another factor that drew attention was timing. Items were allegedly returned very soon after high-profile appearances, not weeks later, not months later, sometimes the next day. While fast returns are not prohibited, they are uncommon for garments associated with major public events. This raised an uncomfortable question that has not been answered publicly. If an item is purchased, worn briefly for a visible appearance, and then returned, where does that leave the brand? The visibility has been extracted. The garment's status has changed, yet the financial transaction is reversed. Some commentators have framed this as a gray area. Others describe it as a misuse of systems designed for good faith customers. No official position has been released, so these remain interpretations, not conclusions. What followed only adds to the confusion. Instead of a quiet correction or a shift in behavior, the same patterns reportedly continued. That persistence is what often prompts institutions to escalate internally, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Luxury brands protect their image with extreme care. When questions touch on integrity rather than aesthetics, patience tends to run out. This is not because of personal feelings, but because consistency is the foundation of their business. By this stage, the discussion had moved beyond individual garments. It had become about whether a line had been crossed, intentionally or not. And once that question exists, it rarely disappears on its own. This is why the conversation did not remain contained. It began to ripple outward, drawing attention from areas that usually remain disconnected from fashion disputes. Areas where documentation matters more than narrative, and where explanations are expected to be supported by records rather than reputation. This is where the situation began to change in a way that could no longer be managed quietly. According to general industry practice, when internal reviews reach a certain threshold, they move from informal observation to formal documentation. This does not mean a conclusion has been reached. It means the questions are now being treated as serious enough to preserve evidence rather than impressions. In this fictional setting, people familiar with luxury operations suggest that records were pulled and compared across time. Purchase dates, return dates, payment methods, store locations. None of these details are dramatic on their own. Together, they can reveal patterns that are difficult to dismiss. Patterns do not accuse, but they do persist. One pattern that reportedly stood out was consistency. The same explanations, the same timeframes, the same logistical pathways. Items allegedly moved in and out of circulation with precision. For observers trained to detect irregular behavior, this kind of regularity can be more notable than chaos. Another pattern involved visibility. Several garments associated with returns were said to align closely with public appearances that generated widespread coverage. Red carpets, formal gatherings, industry events. These were moments when clothing served a clear purpose beyond personal use. They were moments when images circulated globally within hours. Again, none of this confirms intent, but it raises a question that does not have an easy answer. At what point does repeated short-term use blur the line between ownership and access? In high-value fashion, that line matters deeply. Brands price items not only for their materials, but for their exclusivity. Once an item has been publicly associated with a well-known figure, it cannot return to anonymity. Even if undamaged, it has been altered in a commercial sense. As discussions continued internally, some attention reportedly shifted to process control. Who initiated purchases, who authorized returns, who physically handled the garments. Large teams create distance between decision makers and actions. That distance can protect individuals from blame, but it can also complicate explanations. In this fictional narrative, there was no sudden confrontation, no dramatic refusal at a counter. Instead, there was a gradual tightening. Returns were scrutinized more closely. Questions were asked with more specificity. Timelines were examined with less flexibility. This is often how institutional tension appears from the outside. Nothing seems to happen until suddenly something does. According to unverified discussion, one particular transaction became a turning point, not because it was the most expensive, but because it broke the pattern of smooth resolution. An item was allegedly returned with signs that could not be easily explained away. The details of that incident have not been confirmed, and no official account has been released. Still, insiders suggest it forced a decision. At that moment, what had been an internal concern reportedly became a formal matter. Documentation was consolidated. Communications were preserved. Internal policies were reviewed. These are steps organizations take when they believe an issue may not resolve through routine customer service. It is important to note what did not happen. There was no public accusation, no press leak attributed to the brand, no attempt to shape public opinion. Silence remained the strategy. That silence, however, was no longer passive. Another layer of complexity emerged around the broader business environment. Public figures often operate through corporate entities. Purchases may be logged as business expenses. Appearances may be tied to media production. In such cases, clothing can shift categories depending on use. This creates legitimate accounting challenges, but also increases the need for clarity. Some commentators began to speculate carefully about whether the issue touched on more than fashion. Not because of any confirmed wrongdoing, but because repeated ambiguity can attract scrutiny from areas that prefer clean lines. As this phase unfolded, reactions within adjacent industries became noticeable. Stylists reportedly grew cautious. Invitations slowed. Informal lending practices were reconsidered. This was not punishment, it was risk management. When uncertainty grows, access narrows. The most telling sign, according to observers, was the absence of reassurance. Usually, when misunderstandings arise between influential figures and institutions, back-channel communication resolves them quickly. Statements are made, relationships are reaffirmed, life moves on. Here, that did not happen. Instead, the distance widened. Professional courtesy remained, but warmth cooled. The lack of visible repair suggested that whatever questions existed had not been answered to mutual satisfaction. This is often how larger stories take shape, not through confrontation but through accumulation, small decisions adding up, doors closing quietly, patterns solidifying without explanation. By the time awareness spread beyond insiders, the narrative was no longer about individual actions. It was about systems responding to perceived risk, and once systems move, they do not reverse easily. This is why the tension continued to rise, even without public drama. The story had entered a phase where outcomes would be determined by documents, timelines, and interpretations rather than interviews or reputation. And as that reality set in, attention shifted outward, toward how the public, the media, and the institutions that orbit influence might respond to a situation that refused to stay simple. This is when the discussion moved into a broader space, one where control becomes harder to maintain. Even without official statements, shifts in behavior are noticed. Invitations change, conversations pause, people who usually speak freely begin choosing their words more carefully. In worlds built on access, silence can be as informative as noise. According to general public commentary, the fashion industry responded first, though quietly. Stylists who work across multiple brands reportedly began adjusting their approach. Requests that once moved quickly started taking longer. Informal arrangements were replaced with stricter terms. Nothing was explained publicly, but the atmosphere changed. Luxury institutions are closely connected. Editors, brand executives, event planners, and advertisers rely on one another. When uncertainty touches one part of that network, others pay attention. Not because of loyalty, but because reputation is shared currency. No one wants to be caught unprepared if questions become public. Media coverage, however, remained restrained. This was not a story with leaked documents or dramatic visuals. There were no confirmed filings to analyze, no named sources on record. For outlets that rely on verification, there was little to report without risking speculation. As a result, the story lived mostly in whispers rather than headlines. That did not mean it was ignored. Observers noted subtle shifts in tone. Commentary about fashion choices became more cautious. Praise softened. Absences from certain events were noticed but not explained. These are the kinds of changes that rarely trend online but signal movement behind the scenes. Institutions tend to respond not to rumor, but to risk. If a situation carries the potential to escalate into something formal, they prepare. This preparation often looks like distance, waiting, letting others move first. According to some industry observers, one of the most significant reactions came from event organizers. Major fashion events depend on brand sponsorships. They cannot afford uncertainty around participants who may be involved in unresolved disputes with key partners. In such cases, exclusion does not require judgment, it requires caution. No official bans were announced, no lists were published, but patterns of attendance shifted. Invitations that once seemed likely did not materialize. Explanations, if given at all, were vague. Scheduling conflicts, theme alignment, capacity limitations. Publicly, these reasons sounded ordinary. Privately, they reflected a tightening circle. At the institutional level, discussions reportedly focused on precedent. If a luxury brand felt its systems had been tested, others would reassess their own exposure. This is how industries protect themselves, not by reacting loudly, but by quietly changing rules. Some commentators framed this as unfair. Others saw it as inevitable. When trust erodes, flexibility disappears. Even the appearance of impropriety can be enough to shift policy. Meanwhile, the public figure at the center of the discussion remained largely silent. No detailed response was offered. No clarification was issued. Silence can be strategic. It can also reflect the complexity of a situation where words may create more questions than answers. This silence, however, created space for interpretation. Online discussions filled gaps with theory rather than fact. Some defended her, others criticized. Most lacked access to real information. The result was noise without resolution. What stood out was how institutions avoided joining that noise. Brands did not comment. Editors declined to speculate. Event planners redirected questions. This collective restraint suggested that many were waiting for clarity from a process not yet visible. In the background, policy conversations reportedly advanced. Internal guidelines were reviewed. Lending practices were reconsidered. Documentation requirements were strengthened. These changes were not framed as responses to a single individual, but as improvements to protect against future uncertainty. This is often how influence quietly reshapes systems. One unresolved situation can lead to rules that affect many. As time passed, it became clear that the story was not fading. It was simply moving at a pace set by institutions rather than headlines, and that is why attention began to turn toward a larger question, not what happened, but why this discussion refused to settle. Why, despite silence and restraint, did it continue to linger in professional circles? Why did it prompt caution rather than dismissal? The answer may lie in what the situation represents rather than what it proves, and that is where the focus now shifts, toward understanding why this story continues to matter, even without confirmation, and why it has not been replaced by something newer or louder. This is why the discussion has not faded, even as days turned into weeks without clear public updates. In stories driven by rumor, interest usually burns fast and disappears just as quickly. What keeps this one alive is not outrage, but uncertainty. The absence of resolution has become the story itself. In public life, many controversies are resolved through statements. Clarifications are offered, mistakes are acknowledged or denied, a narrative is presented, and attention moves on. Here, that familiar cycle has not occurred. Instead, the situation remains suspended, shaped more by what has not been said than by what has. According to general commentary, this has led many observers to view the situation less as a scandal and more as a test, not of character, but of systems. It raises questions about how modern influence operates when it intersects with industries built on strict rules rather than public opinion. Luxury institutions do not rely on popularity, they rely on consistency. Their value is tied to the belief that their processes are controlled and their standards are applied evenly. When a situation challenges that belief, even quietly, it cannot be ignored. Some industry analysts suggest that this is why the response has been slow and methodical. Moving too quickly risks appearing reactive. Moving too slowly risks appearing complicit. The balance lies in preparation, not performance. Another reason the story continues is its broader relevance. Many public figures operate in spaces where personal branding, business activity, and public appearance overlap. Clothing is not just personal choice. It is part of a larger commercial ecosystem. When the boundaries of that ecosystem become unclear, it affects more than one person. This fictional situation has prompted private conversations about access, who receives flexibility, under what conditions, and how much trust is extended based on status rather than documentation. These are uncomfortable topics, but necessary ones for institutions that want to protect themselves. There is also the question of precedent. If systems are seen as easy to navigate around, others may try. If they are seen as firm, behavior adjusts. For industries that depend on perception, this balance matters deeply. Public silence has contributed to the ongoing tension. Without confirmation, supporters feel the need to defend. Critics feel free to speculate. Neutral observers remain uneasy. Everyone waits for something definitive that has not yet arrived. In this vacuum, even small developments take on weight. A missed appearance, a changed partnership, a revised policy. Each is examined for meaning, whether it holds any or not. This is the cost of unresolved stories. They invite interpretation. It is also worth noting that this situation exists within a broader cultural moment. Trust in institutions is often debated. Transparency is demanded, yet privacy is expected. Public figures are scrutinized, but also protected by layers of management. When these forces collide, clarity becomes difficult. Some commentators argue that the story persists because it touches on accountability without offering closure. Others suggest it reflects a shift in how influence is managed. Either way, it resists simple framing. Importantly, there has been no confirmation of wrongdoing. No official findings have been released. No legal outcomes have been shared publicly in this fictional universe. What exists is discussion, observation, and cautious response. That alone is enough to keep attention focused. Institutions tend to move when they must, not when they are asked. Until that moment arrives, they prepare quietly. Public figures, meanwhile, weigh their options carefully. Speaking too soon can complicate matters. Speaking too late can allow narratives to harden. This tension creates a holding pattern, a story that feels unfinished, a situation that seems to be waiting for its next phase. And so it continues, not because it is loud, but because it is unresolved, not because it confirms fears, but because it raises questions that have not yet been answered. As long as that remains true, the discussion will persist, not as a headline, but as a background presence. A reminder that in some cases, the most influential stories are not those that explode, but those that quietly refuse to end. This brings the focus to a final, calmer consideration, not about outcomes, but about reflection, about what this moment reveals and why it has left so many watching, waiting, and wondering what comes next. In moments like this, it is often useful to slow down rather than rush toward conclusions. Stories built on fragments and silence can distort perspective if they are treated as settled facts. What remains clear in this fictional situation is not what has happened, but how uncertainty itself has reshaped behavior. The absence of confirmation has forced restraint. Institutions have responded with caution. Media outlets have chosen distance over speculation. Even public discussion, while persistent, has lacked a single dominant narrative. This tells us something important. When systems designed to manage risk are unsure, they pause. For the public figure involved, the situation represents a rare kind of challenge, one that cannot be resolved through messaging alone. Reputation, influence, and visibility offer little leverage when questions revolve around process rather than perception. In such cases, clarity comes not from explanation, but from documentation and time. For the industries watching, the situation has acted as a quiet mirror. It has highlighted how much modern celebrity culture relies on informal trust. It has also exposed how fragile that trust can be when boundaries are unclear. In response, rules tend to harden, flexibility narrows, access becomes conditional. None of this requires guilt to exist. Systems adjust not only to wrongdoing, but to risk. Even the possibility of misunderstanding can lead to structural change. That is not punishment, it is self-preservation. The public, meanwhile, is left in an unfamiliar position. Accustomed to fast cycles of controversy and resolution, viewers are instead confronted with a story that offers no clear ending, no dramatic turning point, just a slow recalibration unfolding mostly out of sight. This can feel unsettling. Humans prefer closure. We look for lessons, villains, or vindication. But some situations do not provide those elements on demand. They evolve quietly, guided by decisions made far from cameras and comment sections. What this moment ultimately reflects is a shift in how influence is negotiated. As public figures become brands and brands become institutions, the space between personal action and corporate response narrows. Actions once seen as minor can take on larger meaning when repeated. Silence, once strategic, can become conspicuous. For now, the story remains unfinished. It exists in a state of observation rather than judgment. Those closest to the processes involved will move when they are ready, not when curiosity demands it. Until then, the discussion will likely remain subdued but present, not dominating attention, but lingering at the edges. A reminder that not every significant story announces itself loudly, and not every turning point arrives with certainty. Sometimes what matters most is not what is proven, but what is reconsidered. And in that sense, this situation has already left its mark, even before its final shape is known.